This is not the Jonsbo N3 build video that I've been promising. Right now, we've got the case and we've got about half of the components here in the studio. I was going to wait it out, maybe wait till all those parts arrive and film the build and show you guys. But I just thought that would take too much time, and we are still going to do it. But I thought in the interim, for those of you that are still on the fence about buying this system, this is not the Jonsbo N3 build video that I've been promising. Jonsbo N3 build video that I've been promising. Well, cheers, mate. Thanks. Get in. Ooh. Wow. Oh, would you look at that? I mean, sure, it's been, what, a couple of months? But at least it's here, right? People give AliExpress quite a lot of stick. But, I mean, they've even gave me a letter. That was really sweet. I mean, it is Christmas. It's time for, you know, being good, goodwill. Oh, that's actually quite touching. Oh, I'd have sent them a message. To Robbie and Eddie. We are sorry this delivery took so long. So we took the time to write you a song. Buying things overseas can be quite a pain. But think of all those dollars, that's your gain. Yes, delivery takes quite a considerable time. But think of all the savings for mistletoe and wine. So from AliExpress, Merry Christmas NAS compares. And don't forget to resolve those import tax affairs. What the f... Hello, and that's right, today we're going to be doing the Jonsbo N3 build. We're going to be doing a TrueNAS scale build with an i9 12th gen Intel and a whole bunch of RAM and bits and bobs. And throughout the course of this video, I'm going to be walking you through exactly how to do it. But before we go any further, a few quick disclaimers. If you have only come for this video just because you want to see the N3 build, you want to see exactly how these components go in, on the timeline at the bottom of the screen you can just skip straight ahead to the actual hands-on. Throughout the course of this video I'm going to be looking at this camera here, and there's another camera up here we're going to be utilising for those close-ups of each of those components. But before we get into the actual build, I do want to take a little bit of time and talk about the components we are using for today's video, as well as the TrueNAS installation. And if you don't care about that stuff and you've already got those and you've just come for the build, you can just skip ahead. But for the rest of you, let's crack on with it. So, we've already talked about the N3, the Jonsbo N3 8-bay enclosure already on the channel. We did that hardware review alluded to in the introduction a couple of months ago, I believe, and we're going to be taking this apart. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here in the intro about the case, because you can watch the hardware review, plus we'll be getting this out on the table. So the 8-bay case that we've mentioned before, what it brings to the table that the N2 doesn't is the fact that, number one, obviously there's 8 bays of storage there. The N3 also brings with it a heightened panel here at the top, which has got additional ventilation on the front and the capacity for larger coolers, something we're going to talk about later on. But the system also arrives with a couple of ventilated fans here and the capacity to add further fans, something I'm not going to be doing in today's build, but one of the main reasons a lot of users are erring weighing up the N3 is because of the price tag, because although it's, you know, not the cheapest case on the market for an 8-bay, particularly on the heels of the popularity of the N2, this case you can get for around the 100 nicker mark, maybe 150. It's going to be very dependent on where you're getting it in the world, and this one we've got for £77 and delivery at £37.82. We will be totting up the prices as we go. The main objective of this video is to try to get the best build we can for sub 500-600 nicker, and throughout the course of this, as we go through each of the components, we'll keep track of all of the pricing and everything we've spent, but there are going to be exceptions to that, which you'll see later on. But there's the case, ventilation all the way around, and again we've got those pseudo trays there, which aren't really trays, they're handles for the drives. More on that later on. We'll get that in there, pop that to that side along with its weird little tray components. and actually go through some of our internal stuff that we're going to be utilising. So I think probably one of the most interesting points, the motherboard is an SRLD3 board there with the i9 pre-attached on here. We got it as a combo there. It was 303 free delivery, including both the motherboard and the CPU. Now let's drill down why exactly we went for this board. Now, we're always going to look at kind of a higher end Intel board. The next video, by the way, is going to be featured on an AMD. Stay tuned for that when it rolls out. But the reason we went for this is obviously, one, we had to go for an ITX board for the Jonsbo case. It only allows you to take advantage of ITX board, even though they've changed the layout internally so that you can have the PSU in a different compartment in a more compact N2 by comparison. You still are limited to ITX or DTX motherboards there, which generally really does limit things like PCIe lanes and SATA connectors, something we'll touch on later on. But the reason we went for this board was twofold. One, because we got a very good bargain getting that inclusive CPU inside there. So the CPU is the Intel 12900HK, a 14-core, 20-thread i9 processor with integrated graphics. It's got three options of power, rated at 35, 45, and up to a whopping 115 TDP when needed and set within BIOS. Also, those graphics are Intel Iris Xe onboard 1.45 gigahertz graphics maximum with the turbo there on board. Rated at over 28,000 even on CPU benchmark. This is a decent little CPU, but it's worth breaking down at those 14 cores are broken down into 6 high performance cores and 8 efficiency cores. And of course, we've got the option to spread those threads out if we wanted to dick around with some virtual machine stuff, with a clock speed at 3.8 base level that can go up to a potential 5 gigahertz. But that was why we went for the CPU inside this, because you can get that CPU surprisingly cheap around the block. The reason we went for this combo motherboard rather than buying them separate is this is a very intriguing board here. Now if we bring that, actually I'll bring it closer to this camera. The things I want us to take on board here. Number one, this is an M-ITX motherboard that takes advantage of full DIMM memory there, something you don't normally find on ITX motherboards. When space is at a premium, they go straight into SODIMM. The next thing worth highlighting is we've got the 2 separate M2 slots. We've got one M2 slot up here, which is a Gen 3 x4, but we also have an additional MoBo, our M2 NVMe here that's ×4 ×4. Now, that in itself shouldn't make this board stand out. However, we have another one on the base. This has a third M.2 NVMe slot, and that is, I don't know how well that'll come out on camera, it is a Gen 4 ×4 M2. So we've got 2 ×4 NVMe's and 1 ×3. Now, clearly there's going to be chipset and CPU layout configurations to factor in there. But having that level of configuration option is going to be very desirable. Now, as mentioned earlier on, as it's an M-ITX, traditionally, unless you go for something like a TopTon, you're going to be limited on the SATAs. Now, we've got 2 SATAs here, and we've got a PCIe slot, which ideally we don't really want to use up unless we have to with a PCIe card. We have a PCIe SATA adapter card in the in the background that we might use for this video if things don't work out. However, in order to get around these 2 little ports limitation here on that motherboard, coming back to this camera, we went ahead and spent £8 quid plus £2 delivery on an M2 to SATA adapter. This will be going in to that Gen 3 slot there, and this allows us to add an additional 6 SATA ports to this motherboard. Those 6 SATA ports there, they are going to be crucial in these 6 and those 2 SATA ports inside there, giving us those full 8 SATA bay potential inside this device. So that's the main reason we went for this M-ITX. One, an incredible price point for what we were getting, and also a tremendous amount of expandability there. Now, if we move those 2 parts to one side, we can talk about some of the other smaller but definitely necessary components. Things like SATA cables. Not only did we utilize a very similar SATA fan out cable that we utilised before, and this is a 6 to 6. We didn't go for angular cables because we wanted to go for a combined cable, but I appreciate spaces at a premium on this, so nevertheless I would recommend you go for an angle cable. And also on top of that, we went ahead within the motherboard, we noticed that there was additional SATA included. So we still have enough SATA cables to cover this whole installation there. We've got the back planes, and we've got a lot of information about adding the Wi-Fi 6 card if we chose to down the line on this. Now again, it was 303 NICA for the combined combined motherboard and CPU, and we'd already spent 77 NICA on the Jonsbo N3 and an additional 37 on shipping. The cable, again, very cheap, around 6 quid. Call it an extra quid for those SATA cables if you were pricing them up. Now with memory, we wanted to go Johnny Big Bananas. So we went ahead and got ourselves a couple of fairly aggressive 32, we got 32 gig across two 16 gig slots here. And again, these are Killis 3. Again, not a big known brand. Let's be realistic. We're trying to keep this as budget friendly as possible. But nevertheless, we were able to pick up 32 gig of DDR4 memory for this Jonsbo build for, looking at my notes, £30.88. And again, that was free delivery, no additional shipping. These are 3200 megahertz sticks there that are going to occupy this whole machine. Non-ECC memory, because I believe that CPU doesn't support ECC. I'll have to double check, but I don't think it does. But nevertheless, because we were keeping things cost efficient, we decided to away from that. Next up, CPU cooler. I mentioned earlier on that one of the benefits that the Jonsbo N3 has over the N2, and we have done a direct comparison video between these, is that the N3 allows more space for larger coolers, and more aggressive CPUs do certainly see the benefit of larger CPU coolers, and particularly in the confined nature of the Jonsbo case, that is going to be paramount for some builds, particularly those of you that are going to be taking advantage of graphics cards and more, as more AI utilization and just, you know, in-house gaming server builds are starting to come out of the DIY scene. Now, this CPU here, CPU fan I should say, this is the Thermalright SI100. It's a 120mm low-high quiet fan, 2000 RPM CPU cooler here. So that's our baseline CPU cooler. I'll bring it to the other camera. And again, this is going to fit neatly inside this case. We're actually going to have a bit of space to play with inside this case. This is a 90mm height fan, so we've still got a decent amount of space to decide to integrate the inclusive additional fan there inside our casing. It will fit inside that structure, which is going to be really, really good to hear. And again, this includes all of our thermal, it includes any kind of cabling we need. It is pretty much to go out of the box. And that fan was £22.59. So again, not crazy expensive. It's a quiet fan as well. Overall, happy with that purchase and within the price tag there. Finally, let's talk about power supplies. Now, power supplies, normally, when it comes to these cheap build videos that I will do, the PSU, although we don't really want to cut corners, there are ways to get cheaper PSUs. And I think a lot of you, when we looked at the N2 build, were saying that the PSU we went for there wasn't very good. And I see where you're coming from. But nevertheless, we're going for an SFX Gold here. This is from a company known as First Player. Found them on AliExpress, and I think they're listed on Amazon US as well. Why did we go for this one? Well, first and foremost, it's an 80 plus gold SFX small scale PSU there, because SFX PSUs, which is what you need for the Jonsbo builds, the SFX PSUs, you tend to find they're quite expensive, and certainly when you get into the 80 plus rating, and definitely small scale ones, which this build will certainly benefit from, given its smaller stature, that's when prices start to really ramp up. And one of the best prices we could find online was this one. Now, there's lots of brands. I think the one that everyone talks about more than any is the Steampunk SFX PSU from First Player. This isn't that one. This is their standard one here, whereas it's called the name here. We had it here on screen earlier. This is the Warrior Full Slam, and this is a low noise modular, so all the cables are completely removable PSU. It also arrives with 7 years of manufacturer's warranty, something that kind of really won us over there. And for a 650 watt PSU, we were able to see it online at prices ranging from $79 up to $89, which for the power we're getting and for a gold PSU, we were really impressed by. And if you're going to scale towards a graphics card in your Jonsbo build, it's probably better to early doors ramp up that PSU just a little bit, because you're not going to use all that power on day one, and later on you can scale up towards it. But of course, if you're going to go down that road of adding, you know, your 500, 650, 750, whatever watt PSU, just keep in mind that that's when that gold 80 is going to make its difference. And the same goes for like platinum and more, because a PSU, yes, a 350 watt PSU of any kind will give you that 300 watt power when you need it, but it's about the efficiency and how much loss there is of that power. But nevertheless, that's the PSU we're going with here in today's Jonsbo N3 build. We'll get that open up when we get it installed later on. So now we know the components we're playing with today that are included, but I will highlight there are some components in today's build that unfortunately we're going to have to skirt around the edges just a wee bit. Namely, storage. Now, the storage is going to be an area of question here, because although I'm not going to include it in the pricing, there is no denying you're going to need to buy media for this build. So, for example, we're using an Iron Wolf 525 NAS SSD for this build. Now, this SSD at 1 TB knocks around for about 50-60 nicker. But I will say there are definitely cheaper SSDs out there. I'm using it because we've had it here in the channel from other videos. It seems silly to just buy another drive and add to the e-waste pile that these videos can generate sometimes. So I'm using this, and we're not going to include it in the pricing because you can get away with very small SSDs if you choose to. You could go ahead, and if you look at our video about media usage and buying secondhand media, you'll know that you can buy stacks of SATA SSDs these days for peanuts. These are a stack of 120 gig SSDs. We picked up 20 of them for £100 ex laptop stock. So again, if you want to get yourself a drive, there are loads of ways in which you can do that, but we're not including it in the price. The same goes for the storage media. We're going for a very specific setup here. We're going to be going for two parity RAID builds here, so we're going to go for two individual pools here within TrueNAS scale, but you're not going to go for that. So we're not going to include the cost of the media, but if you need to know, traditionally NAS hard drives are about $30 to $40 per terabyte, and of course the larger capacities you go, the lower that price per terabyte goes to. And the same goes if you're going to go for an M.2 NVMe for your OS. Again, how much you're going to see the benefit from that in something like TrueNAS scale, we'll have to wait and see, because it's not a storage drive in that capacity. You're looking at about 50-ish nicker dollars, whatever's your currency, per terabyte there. But we're not including it in our pricing, but these are nevertheless the drives that we're going to be using in today's video. So there you go, there are all of the components. Apart from that, why are we using TrueNAS scale? Well, nice and simple. One, we've not really covered TrueNAS scale that much on this channel. Two, TrueNAS scale does bring with it a lot of the benefits of Linux applications and more, and I just think we should really fly the flag a little bit more for TrueNAS scale. And I think given TrueNAS scale's abilities and more flexibility towards a lot of the applications that are available to be installed on it, and indeed the usability of some of those tools, that's why we wanted to include scale. But there you go, those are our parts. But I think right now it's time to roll up our sleeves and start getting to business, right? So, cracking on with the build. First thing we're going to need to do is take care of cooling for that CPU. It's lovely and fine that they put the CPU there, and again with that base level cover there on the top, but we need to start working on getting that dissipating cooling and heatsink here applied to our MoBo there with the CPU inside there, which is going to require a whole lot of plates, because as much as I love the base of this having an M2, one of the things it doesn't have is the plate kit for that cooler, because obviously we bought it separately. So there's going to be bits of this video that are just going to be super dull. Really sorry if you already know how to do this, but I'm doing this for everyone. I might speed things up, but moving over to the other camera, there is our motherboard there on screen, and underneath there is our plate getting ready. So let's go ahead with our plate. The first thing I'm going to need to do is get our little rubber panels there in place, because there's a whole lot of timing and angle work that needs to be done here to get this on. A lot of people kind of take for granted in the pre-builds that this stuff kind of arrives as standard, but the sad truth is most users will have to go out of their way to get this stuff applied on there pretty much on day one. So we get some of these inside there, get them lined up. Be very careful how you touch the board there with the screws. Don't go doing any unnecessary scraping there. And get that on board there, meeting the alignment of those screws. Use the screws to sort of guide in those little washers there on board. And we'll get that last one there underneath. Get that out, being very careful around the board. Get that there. And there we go, we've got our alignment of those all ready on the other side. So from there, what we need to do is get the washers on the other side. So generally I find it a lot easier to just use a little plate to hold that in place, or maybe in just a cardboard box, just nothing that can carry friction, and it allows all of those screws to be accessible a great deal more easily. So next thing we need to do is get these little washers on there. These tiny little washers here that reside on each of those screws, and these are kind of acting as a kind of elasticity and a little bit of a buffer for when we apply the major heatsink here on top. So next up, we've got to think about where the CPU cooler is going to be sitting in terms of direction. Why is that important? Well, because when you are applying the plates that hold the PSU in, it's worth keeping in mind that when you do that, the CPU fan will have to point a certain direction, and I am doing a Jonsbo N3 build. You might not be doing that. You may be doing an N2 with a smaller CPU fan cooler, or you might be running a completely different build altogether with a bigger, beefier CPU or CPU heatsink. Now this CPU, although it is lower profile than some in the market, it's still pretty darn tall, and I'm going to have to make a choice whether I want to go ahead and have it overhanging the PCIe slot, which will then limit the number of the width of the PCIe cards I can use into the future, or I can have it overhanging the DIMM slots here for our memory, which means the height of those memory are going to be a factor. And of course over here we've got our two M2 NVMe slots, which consequently means that they may have beefy heat sinks on top. This is a Gen 4 CPU lanes. I'm not too worried about some Gen 5 crazy town cooling systems, but had I been looking at Gen 5 SSDs like this one, which have got significantly higher heat sinks, that is going to be problematic with our CPU fan here. So make some choices about how and where you want this fan to be pointing. In my case, I'm going to be erring towards this CPU fan overhanging here. This CPU fan is now going to be overhanging the ports. It happens that there is space in this case for that to happen, but it may not be the case for you. Normally, this is pretty much the accepted standard, but there are differences with regards to build and spacing within your enclosure that you may wish to use. Now, so I can do it that way, what I'm going to need to do is apply these little hooks. Now these hooks are the ones that we're going to be laying on top of the screws that we've allied earlier, and on top of there, make sure they are face upright and pointing towards the CPU fan that you're going to be using. So in my case, I'm going to be popping that there, and make sure they're in alignment and they're in the same slot, in the same gauge spot for both. Go ahead and repeat that on the other side there. They should go in alignment nice and easily, and they should line up quite neatly together. So from this point, what we need to do is get the little the riggers to go on top, and this is how we secure these to the base of that CPU there, moving along. So we'll get those screwed in. We'll fast forward a moment. Now double check before you go any further that the CPU fan meets the alignment of each of those individual screws underneath, because from this moment, that is when you're going to have to thinking about choices that's going to be very, very difficult to reverse. Which brings us now on to the integrating and adding of that CPU fan and cooler here to this system. And this is one of the other reasons we went with the Erying MoBo there. Now, as mentioned earlier on, this is the SRLD3 board here with that i9 on board. If I bring that closer to the camera, and you may have already picked up on this earlier in the video, but this is where we get this plate here on the top. The CPU is effectively soldered to the board here, much like a mobile SoC CPU there on board, and it has this dissipation plate which we can directly apply our heatsink onto here with the attached fan there on the top. But this does result in, again, remember I mentioned earlier on about the angle of the fan there, which is going to be heavily dependent on the layout of your system, where the system fans are going to be and more. It's going to mean that wherever it is that we're going to be applying this, we're going to have to apply the silicon paste directly the thermal paste onto the fan, not the CPU, just to make sure that we accurately affect them both on there. Now, as this is an Intel CPU, I'm going to go for the standard 5-dot method, but I know if you're using AMD, it'll be slightly different. So we're just going to go ahead and pop ourselves 5 dots here, there in each corner of that CPU, before we go ahead and attach it there to the plate that's been given to us here. Let's bring that down. Get that plunger to do its job a little better there. Don't go in too heavy and hard while you're doing this. You want to make sure while you're running this in that you're getting resistance, but not too much that you're risking the fan damaging the board it's going into. So you want to make sure it's rigid, but you don't want to go in too hard that you end up cracking the MoBo that it's running through onto those plates. Just make sure you wait until you get a decent amount of resistance, and then just double check along the base of the board that that CPU has full contact with the paste that you've applied there. Next up, let's get the fan here that mounts on top of that CPU cooler there. So we've already got that applied there nice and neatly. And what we need to do is apply those different clips there on the side, and then slowly apply them there. Sometimes it's easier to kind of guide it in from one side of the CPU in a hinge affair while it goes into one of the grooves. Hook it in like so, and align it there on the other side, turning around the motherboard and just popping in the other side like so. It should slot neatly into the sides of that PSU cover. Now we've got the fan applied there at the top. We've gone ahead and applied both clips either side to keep it in place nice and rigidly there. We've got ourselves quite a tall affair here for this rather beefy CPU here. So next up, we need to get ourselves our fans. Again, depending on the motherboard you use, it's going to be different, but just make sure you get that CPU power fan in there very early doors. Notwithstanding that sometimes it will actually prevent the system booting if you don't have a fan in there, or it doesn't at least acknowledge the fan. But also some fans like this one will also have the fan control cable, which will depend on your motherboard of choice whether you can go ahead and pop that in there. Likewise, if you're going to be utilizing a motherboard that has got the additional component part there to take advantage of the LED capabilities of a fan, you know, roll with it. But me personally, I'm not going to be utilizing that in this build, but just bear in mind you do have those additional cables with this particular CPU cooler. Okay, so now the more, you know, chunky and bits and bobs component in our entire installation is now completed. We want to go ahead with the more modular components and boards before we make our way into the Jonsbo itself. So straight away, we've got that 32 gig of Celeron memory here that's going inside, so we can get those into alignment, get those on board. Again, as mentioned earlier on, the alignment of the CPU fan is going to differ on a lot of different users and what they would normally do in this build case. So don't feel tied in with the way that I've gone ahead and installed that module there, simply because it works for me and this board in this case. You may not see the benefits of doing it that way in your own setup there. Let's go ahead and get our secondary board. Make sure we've got that the correct way round. And get in our second stick nice and easily, levered in from the side. Again, we went for memory modules that got that onboard heat dissipation there built in with those heat sinks, which is going to be hugely advantageous given the scale of hardware inside this case. See, the light sensor here on this camera has decided to go absolutely bananas, but there's our second DIMM module here going into our slot. Let's slot that in there. Not too tight, make sure it all clicks in neatly. Next up, let's talk about those M2 NVMe's that we're going to be utilizing there. As mentioned earlier on, we do have that baseline one here, very small slot here, and in order to see just the extent to which all of these are supported, I'm going to stick in an additional M2 NVMe, not part of this build, but just to see the arrangement of all of those M2s and the default BIOS is visible. So not only are we going to go with the Seagate Ironwall 525 inside here, we're also going to be utilizing a FireCuda 530, and this is my own special Star Wars drive which we're using for this test, which I will definitely be removing shortly after the test is concluded there. But for now, we'll go ahead and put that Ironwolf drive in the base section there. And this is a Gen 4 x 4 slot that we've got there. We're going to be utilizing 2 Gen 4 drives in the Gen 4 slot, and the Gen 3 slot is the one that we're going to be utilizing with the SATA adapter that we talked about earlier on. But for now, let's get this drive in here. We're going to need ourselves our screwdriver, Just get that screw out. That is our M2 holding screw. Pop that in there. Again, I need to reiterate, this is not SATA. This is another PCIe Gen 4 M.2 NVMe 2280 links SSD. And again, this motherboard is quite the Frankenstein board. When you do dig into a lot of the motherboards that are on offer from Erying, you find some real strange boards knocking around there. And this is the tip of the iceberg. This is probably one of the more powerful ones that I saw, but it is powerful relative to the build, of course. So let's go ahead now and get our Mandalorian drive, the Beskar ingot drive. Again, we've talked about this in other testing here on the channel. And again, we'll get that slotted inside. And of course, we could have done this before we put in that CPU fan there. It would have been very easy to do so. We could have popped it in nice and easy. But the only reason I didn't is I wanted a clear room of approach to put in that CPU fan and all the other parts and not manhandle it any more than I already am for this video. But let's get that CPU, the SSD screw inside there. Thank you, magnetic screw. You are doing your job. Put that there. Because we've only got the one M.2 adapter left to go in, and that is the most peculiar one of the lot. Something that a lot of you raised in the past when it came to a few of my build guides when I was talking about using SATA cards. And one of the main reasons I very rarely ever talk about these, notwithstanding I genuinely did forget in that previous video, is that these are surprisingly hard to come by from any particularly reputable source. And even we saw this on AliExpress. Most of the stores that we could find it on, if you can Google this yourself or go onto that site, they're kind of, you know, blink and you miss it. They seem like more of a purchase at OEM level, distribution and manufacture, particularly with things like the AIO T6 Changwon case that we built here on the channel. It doesn't seem to be a very universally available adapter in most sites. You can find it, of course, on your Amazon, your eBays, your Allies, but it's not the most common component you can find out there. But nevertheless, it is, I would argue, a very nuanced and, you know, refined solution to ITX motherboards, simply lacking all of the available M.2s, SATA ports on that smaller frame. And another thing I will touch on, I should have mentioned this in the introduction, when we did purchase this board, it even arrived with this freaky little adapter board here. This, I don't mean, it took me a while to figure out what it was, and this was an M.2 to small factor M.2 adapter here. It allowed you to utilize a single adapter board and convert it into dual M.2s. And the only reason I'm not using it in today's video was simply that I already had space at a relative minimum, and although I could utilize this in the available, if we have a little look there, what is traditionally considered to be the M.2 wireless card slot, utilizing it in there would have been problematic in terms of spacing. But nevertheless, when I did get this from the listed manufacturer earlier on, you will see that it, you know, maybe it's a one-off, I'm not sure, but both of those parts were included in the little bag. Okay, we've got both of our M.2 NVMEs inside, we've got our memory sticks, we've got our CPU on board here. I think we are finally ready to start getting the case here into the field of play. Cracking on with the Jonsbo itself, given its, you know, rather compact framework, even for an 8-base system, it has to be said that getting things in the wrong order here will seriously screw up your Jonsbo build. So the order that I'm doing things right now is power supplier into cabling, into MoBo, into connection of power. Now bear that in mind as we go through these steps, because again, nowhere in the documentation, nowhere in any else I could find online are these steps made abundantly clear that if you do not do these in the right order, you are effectively going to reverse everything. It's what we went through with the N2 series Jonsbo, and if we didn't do it right here, it's what would happen. So what we're going to be doing is immediately removing this top panel. This top panel is held in place by 4 screws at either corner. These take advantage of an Allen key that is included with the pack that you get the system with, but you can use fairly standard laptop screwdrivers to get that off of there. It's 4 screws either side. That gives you some idea about the height there we're going to be playing with later on with that CPU fan. Now on top of that, later on, but we can do it now anyway, if we switch to the other camera, we can see those 2 rear fans there. And what we want to do now is remove these two thumb screws. The reason being, these two thumb screws hold in place not only those fans, but also behind it, this panel, we have got those SATA connectors, something we're going to have to touch on later on. I just thought I would remove them now because it will be a great deal more convenient to do that now than later. But the first thing we want to attend to is the PSU. Unlike the Jonsbo N2 series, which took advantage of a PSU that slotted in the rear of this, this actually takes advantage of a PSU that is held around up here in this top quadrant and uses an extension cable here on the back that funnels through to that power supplier here. So once again, getting the PSU and getting the right frame size of PSU is going to be very, very important here. And that is where that first player PSU comes in. Not only because of its smaller form factor that we talked about already, but also the fact that it is modular. Now, the PSU we used in the Jonsbo N2 build was not modular. Again, we found some cabling very, very tight indeed. We had to reverse the PSU internally because of it potentially undermining its airflow. But in the case of this system, because once again cabling is so refined, we're going to have to go modular on this. So again, we'll go through each cable one by one when we connect them, but it is worth highlighting that if you do go for a PSU that's non-modular, you may have to rejig the last two steps of this installation. But what you need to do inside this casing is a plate here that we have to go ahead and connect onto our PSU. Make sure the power supply has got power at the top, because when we put this inside, we have to make sure that the hook element of this PSU clip is at the top as well. So make sure we have the plug at the top and the hook at the top. And now it's just going to be a case of attaching it like so, like that. It's held in place by 6 screws located all the way around it. So I'll do that now. Fast forward. When you've got that plate attached to this PSU, as you can see here, we need to aim for this cavity here. You see these 2 screw holes here? This is where this clip here is going to attach here. Now inside you're going to see that arrangement of cables. The one we need to be mindful of is this one here. This attaches to our front panel. Meanwhile, this one we need to bring out of this area. What we need to do now is align this with the screw holes inside. It will align with those screws here at the top, and from there we can go ahead and start screwing in that PSU. On top of that, this power supply here needs to be in alignment with the inside. So again, we're going to need to span it up, hook it inside, and bring it into the angle there underneath that clip. Now, I've mentioned this in other videos before, but I will say again, I absolutely hate this internal PSU location here. I get it, they're trying to make this thing within the same framework as its predecessor, and on the face of it, having that PSU in there doesn't seem too bad, right? Even with that cable, once you funnel it in just right, it does go in relatively neatly, but I don't like the fact that I can't immediately access that switch inside. But that said, we've now got that board, the board ready to go in. But before we go with the board, what we need to do now is attend to those SATA cables there at the back. So the next thing we need to do is grab ourselves the Molex PSU cable for our PSU. Again, if you're using it already pre-attached, you won't need to worry about this. But what you need to do now is attach the PSU end, if you do have a modular PSU, to the available IDE/SATA connectors there on the rear. So if I bring that close to the camera, you can make that out. There is our IDE SATA there at the base. So what we need to do is get that inside one of those. Get that connected. As you can see, there it is inside that port down there. And then what we want to do is funnel it down this hole here. This hole here at the bottom, you can just make it out, that little rectangle. That rectangle is for our SATA cables and SATA power that's going to be running in to the individual Molexes on the rear of this board. Funneling that down to the bottom and bring that round to you guys there. We're now able to see the arrangement. I'm just going to move the mic So you've now got the arrangement of cables inside here. Now, there's a cable here. This is our data cable here that's running in. So we're going to largely ignore that and push that out of the way. But what we want to do is ensure that our Molex connectors are connected to each, move that out of the way, each of our SATA connectors here. I'm sorry about the scraping metal noises. And additionally, there is a SATA power in there, which you can go ahead and use an existing SATA connector going into that PSU, or like this PSU from First Player, there is an additional Molex there that we could run a SATA adapter into there. Again, we'll check later on if we need that and maybe amend it, but for now, we've got that power running into that board, and the next thing we want to do is connect all of those individual SATA data connectors. So this is where our multi-lane cable comes in, alongside our additional singular SATA cables here. Again, make sure all cables are funneling through that small rectangle square that I highlighted earlier on. Take one end of the multi-lane cable and poke it through that slot there at the top, leaving it just reconnected out the other side. Now, be mindful that the individual cables are numbered, so make sure you select P1 for slot 1, P2 for slot 2, etc, etc. Once you've got all of those SATA cables connected, as you can see there, what we need to do now is reattach the two rear fans. Now, when you get this system out the gate, it will have those two fans, but they will not be connected because obviously most users are going to pull off the back there. So just be mindful that you do connect these fans before closing this aperture on the rear of the device. Make sure that no cables have been trapped in the alignment of putting that back case section on, and then use the thumb screws to put the two fan screws in there, and that will hold the assembly there on the rear in place. Nice and simple. Pop that in there. And now, of course, we can make our way out to something even greedier, and that, of course, is our MoBo. We're going to be getting our motherboard now inside the top of this case. So let's go ahead there. We'll change the camera angle a little bit. So first things first, we want to go ahead and get in our back panel there, the I/O panel there, and get that just neatly tucked into it there. Make sure that the writing is legible from the rear, so that means you know you're getting it in the right direction, although obviously you can measure against the motherboard itself if you prefer. Get it in, wait until you hear the click. You put it in. Once you've heard that, there you go, the alignment's in place. Go ahead and slowly ease in the motherboard there. Again, we've already attached everything we need to do there, but for now, we can go ahead very gently easing in that motherboard, making sure while we do so that we don't block out any of the cables that we already pulled out earlier on, which are going to be feeding in to this motherboard. So, standing up here, as you can see there, the alignment, it's lined up with all of the screws. We'll remove that LED fan for just a moment, but for now, once we've got the port in alignment, like so, all of the screws are now in complete alignment for us to go ahead and start attaching our motherboard in the 4 individual locations. So next up, we want to start attaching some of these extraneous accessory cables, not just the SATA, but the front panel. Now, before we go any further, the motherboard we are using today does support the newer generation of front panel connector there. When you're using Type-C, or if you're using some of the multifaceted connected ports, you will find new connectors internally, something the Jonsbo N2 didn't have, and we had to use an adapter in order to take advantage of that. Luckily, this motherboard and this system with Type-C connectivity works together, but do bear in mind if you are going to go for the front panel on this system to go directly into the motherboard without adapters, double check first the ports that are allotted to you, because a lot of M-ITX boards, as mentioned, do have a tendency to get rid of the extraneous stuff in a number of ways. But for now, let's crack on and get the rest of these cables integrated in. So we're going to go for the cables that we already know. So straight away, we've got our SATAs 1 through 6, which we're going to go ahead and connect directly into that SATA M.2 we got earlier on. So let's go ahead and get those installed inside. Alongside those SATAs, we're also going to take advantage of those last 2 SATAs, utilising the 2 SATA ports directly on this M-ITX board. Again, we'll be able to funnel them directly here, but it is something of a tight squeeze between the memory modules and this PSU internally. I'll do a quick close-up when this is done. Now those are done, we have to go ahead and get our F panel cables all connected. Again, this will differ depending on the motherboard you choose to use, but for me it's located at each of the adjoining corners all the way along. I'll fast forward to after these are connected. So now that's all been connected, all that's left to do in terms of hardware is connecting our PSU to the motherboard via the two prerequisite connectors. Again, as this is a modular PSU, we've got ourselves individual cables that will take advantage of this layout here. So the first one we're going to go with is our mainline cable, the 20+4 here, that's going into that main connector there. So now the PSU has been connected to the board, all of the SATA cables are connected, the front panel is connected, the fans are connected, everything is connected. But it has to be said, once again, as we mentioned in our hardware review, that is not a lot of space to play with. Bring it to the other camera, there is a lot of cable management I'm going to have to do before I boot this up. Notwithstanding funneling a lot of those PSU cables, which can theoretically run underneath the motherboard there, I would still say it does hugely limit the capacity of cabling around this. And I think this case could stand to be maybe an inch deeper, just somewhere where we can refine a lot of that cabling. Bear in mind again, this is a smaller scale SFX PSU than some of the ones in the market. And if we hadn't gone for this one, then chances are we might have had an even bigger problem with cable routing throughout this device. But what I'm going to do now is get some of the routing of the cable sorted out, get the lid back on, go through some drive attachments there, and then finally boot the device up. Which leads us to probably the one thing about this case that really winds me up. And it is something that I disliked about the N2, and the N3 has not improved upon it. And that is, of course, the way the storage is handled. Those 6 bays inside, which are dual SATA and SAS connectors there, but of course you will need a specific SAS connector to take advantage of them. You've got those trays ready to use, you know, there's direct in there, the combined SATA data power there at the rear, really good stuff. So it really winds me up that in order to use the storage on this, I have to use these detestable plastic handles. Now, I know some of you might think I'm being a bit OTT about this, but it's just, if I am hot swapping a drive when needed, if I need to swap a drive out, maybe I've got a degraded RAID volume, RAID storage file I should say, or that my storage needs to be expanded upon, and for one reason or another I have to operate these trays, these do not feel particularly sturdy. I'm just going to make this focus on the other camera here. I'm just going to move the mic. So for example, we'll start installing our drives. I'll go ahead and use some of these 8TB WD Red Pro drives here. And in order to get the drive inside, what we need to do is attach these rubber kind of washers here. We put 2 on the back, 2 on the front, but the 2 on the front, instead of the washers, you use these silly rubber things right here alongside them. So we get ourselves a screwdriver, we use the large arrangement of screws, and we go ahead and start attaching these horrible, silly, flimsy tray things to our drives. Okay, so I've attached these horrible rubber clips to each of these drives, and we're just going to feed these into the individual bays. So if we pop them in there, what happens is you meet the alignment of the rubber clips there into each of the aligning grooves there along the top. You can just make out. and you slide it so they all go in, and you'll hear that satisfying crunch there as the SATA goes into each of the individual bays. Now, I said I'd allude earlier in the video as to why I am utilizing 4 drives there. Well, there's a few reasons. Probably the shortest reason is because I don't have a huge amount of media here in the studio. We're currently testing a whole manner of stuff for January on the other side of the room. But the other reason I was going for 4 very different drives is I'm going to be putting 2 drives in SATA bays 1 and 2 and another 2 SATAs inside. Let's get the alignment just right. Again, I absolutely detest these little rubber things. I'm getting 2 drives inside bays 7 and 8. Now, the reason I'm doing that is because when we connected all the drives, we put 6 of those drives, numbers 1 through 6, I believe, into the M.2 to SATA adapter, whereas the other 7 and 8 slot we fed into the motherboard directly. And I'm going to be very interested to see if all 8 bays appear and if they actually keep the numerical value, given that we're feeding into that M2 adapter, each of which had its own SATA naming, whether the motherboard will push it in front or put it as a minus there. But we've got the 4 drives inside there, so now we can go ahead and attach our front panel. And now we're going to get ourselves our power supplier, we're going to grab ourselves a SATA cable and get this thing connected. Okay, so we've got the device all connected up, we've got the power running into it, we've got the laptop set up via a cable, which you can see here, into a capture card. Hopefully we'll switch over to this because we want to check out the BIOS before we do anything, but for now, let's go. Let's connect to it in. We're powering up. We're looking at the laptop here. Yeah, the fan's powering on. Our capture card is kicking in. We're going to be going with delete to go into setup. Hopefully we've minimized this onto the bottom of the screen. We've got the boot menu option. We can hear those drives spinning up there as well in the background. Hopefully we'll be on to the BIOS any second now. I apologise for the proximity right now between me and that microphone. But there we go, there is our BIOS there. Now, we probably could connect a mouse, but we're going to go with the bog standard keyboard here. As you can see down here, there is our 12th gen i9 12900HK processor there inside. Again, we've recognised the full 32 gig of memory, which is lovely to see. We even got information on the version number there. Now, with regards to our advanced setup there, let's have a look. Sorry, we've got the box underneath the table. We can see fairly standard stuff there in between. CPU configurations there, so this is where we would be able to change out some of the layout, maybe some of the power consumption. Going for it there if we want to sort of stretch this system's muscles just a wee bit. Then we've got the SATA configuration there. We can see the SATA controller, larger drive. Again, we're going to leave everything as default for now. We can definitely see that the 2 SATA cables have been recognised in those main 2 ports, as we can see the WDs that we purposefully dedicated onto that main board. Then we've got the NVMe, and as we can see there, we've got the NVMe SSD controllers 1, 2 and 3 all enabled, and there at the bottom we've got the 2 the 2 Seagates, the FireCuda, and that iWolf recognised there. With regard to the chipset, we can find out more information about the system itself there running on the board. Not too much to write home about, all fairly standard stuff. I'm going to include all of these because I'm fairly certain at least one of you is watching this video because you're thinking of buying this board. I'll say right now, we can hear the fan from that CPU and definitely those 2 rear fans, but without having to remove the lid, I do think the majority of the noise is coming from the rear fans on this system more than that CPU fan. The CPU fan is definitely in operation, but the noise, if we bring that mic a little closer, you'll be able to hear that it's definitely the rear fans and not the CPU fan. Cool, coming along, we can carry on through some more of these advanced options, making our way through the whole system there. All fairly standard stuff, what we would expect. I think we do have to sort of move out the alignment of this screen ever so slightly to fit some of it in. Again, when we get TrueNAS scale on this system, we'll dig in just a wee bit more. We've got the system CPU temp and more, the fan that we can change some of the smart functionality of the fans. Again, it's nice to know we've got all of these controls built in as we would expect, but it's also even nicer to know that this MoBo in its default state was native to the ports and connections afforded to the Jonsbo case here. But coming out of it there, USB configuration, something we're going to be using shortly when we go for our TrueNAS installation. Again, something I'll touch on very briefly before moving on. But all fairly standard stuff there. And again, we're not going to change too much about the power management, particularly the CPU power management. And again, the configuration and options are there. It feels a little basic compared to some of the MoBos or the established brands, your Asus, your Gigabyte, that sort of thing. But the controls you're going to need are indeed there. So for now, let's quit. And for now, let's power this device down very, very quickly. Let's go for ahead and power it down on the main power button there. And here on the screen, we're just going to switch over very quickly to that of OBS. Hopefully you've got that there on screen, because the next thing we need to discuss while we're looking at all of those components that we purchased earlier on, I also want to talk about what we're going to be taking on the next step. So the next step is actually surprisingly straightforward. We just need ourselves a USB stick, which we've got here. Simple 8 gig will suffice. And then on top of that, what we need to do while looking at the screen here, you need to download the tool Rufus. Rufus you can then use to turn an image from any OS or any kind of installation operating system into a USB executor. Then after that, go to TrueNAS Scale, click download. From download, it will ask you to sign up to the newsletter. You don't have to do that if you don't want to, but you can go down there and download the latest version of TrueNAS Scale, which is what we've done, and then just use the Rufus tool to go ahead, insert your USB drive, and then using Rufus, you can go ahead and create that bootable installer there utilizing that drive. Unfortunately, I can't attach this USB to this system without disconnecting the mic, disconnecting the keyboard, or disconnecting the video capture. What I'm going to do now, and you can check out how it's done in my other videos, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and create ourselves our USB TrueNAS Scale installer and make our way back over to the UI of the boot of this system. Okay, so now our USB is ready to go. So let's go ahead and pop that in the rear of our machine here. And it's inside there, and on the laptop here, let's go ahead and swap back over to the output of our streaming box there. But for now, let's go ahead and start this off. Cool, so here we are on the installation, so let's go ahead and install TrueNAS. Cool, looks like we've got some driver irregularities there with a Realtek driver, but let's push on through that. Let's go for an installation here. As we can see the little RAID card going in one of the NVMe's, but interestingly, only the Seagate Iron Wolf is displayed, something we're going to dig into perhaps later on. But for now, let's go ahead and go for the installation there. We'll go for an admin user there, give ourselves a nice easy password. I apologise for how close I'm typing this to the mic. Cool, so the installation has completed, so let's go ahead and reboot this device, this time of course without our tricksy Dixie little USB drive inside. So let's go ahead and reboot the system. USB out, and hopefully by now it will reboot into the system, and then from there reboot from the SSD with TrueNAS, and we can make our way onto the GUI of TrueNAS Scale and find out a little bit more about our setup, what's worked and what hasn't. Okay, so TrueNAS has finished its installation and has fully booted, ending in IP192. So I think we can abandon the HDMI interface now and head straight back into the browser. So it was IP192. So let's go ahead and boom, here we are. So let's head straight in. I think it was lowercase admin. And boom, here we are on our system. Let's see just how much. There is our memory, all lovely and running well. Top left there, we've got our CPU clocking along nicely there in the background. Temperature not too shabby there. Again, we've not made the system do too much. Again, TrueNAS Scale as discussed before. And next up, while we're looking at it here, we're having a little look at that storage there, because I think that's going to be our next big question mark, isn't it? And the good news is all of those drives are recognised. There's the two WD Red 8TB Red Pro drives there. There are our two 10TB Ultrastars that are in assignment slots 7 and 8. And finally, the 1TB drive we stuck on the base of the system there. I believe that was our our Seagate Gen 4 530 Fire CUDA drive there. So again, we can give this a mirror. Go for that next. The layout, we're going for a mirror. We're going to the manual selection, and straight away assign ourselves a couple of those drives there. So we can give ourselves those two drives. Again, filter by disk type. It's all available to us there. We can go with everything that we want to see. There are our 2 drives there that we can go ahead and add those 2 drives. Nice and easy, lovely stuff there. So it's nice to see that we have got all of those options to play with those drives as we see fit. And indeed, if we make our way into a little bit of command line, we can take a little look at the layout of the PCIe and more on this system. Okay, so let's go in, find out more about our layout here. Actually, let's bring the size of that text up just a little bigger so we can see it there. So notwithstanding, there are our 2.5 gigabit Ethernets running like an absolute dream inside here, although I will have to investigate into that Realtek issue. Perhaps it was during the boot there. That Realtek was just that one of the Ethernets were disconnected. I'll dig into that later. There are our FireCuda's drive there. There's the FireCuda 520 and the 530 respectively for each of the individual bays there. And again, in terms of lanes and what's assigned, we'll go into that in just a wee bit longer in just a moment. But for now, I'm seeing some pretty good layout there for everything we're seeing. Just browsing along, this motherboard isn't really hiding anything from us here. I had slight reservations about how much of that CPU layout would be limited to us, but ultimately from what I'm seeing here, everything is what I would like to see. And if we move along further along and sort of go down to the layout of some of the PCIe, okay, let's have a look at the list of disks, and as we can see here, there is that lovely little arrangement. There's our 10s. There are our 8s, and where is our NVMe? There it is down there, NVMe 0N1. Okay, so digging in a little bit deeper into the PCIe lanes, we can take a little look at how they are assigned here. So we've got some of the Intel CPU stuff here, but what we're really interested in, of course, are those individual Gen 4 ×4 lanes, and I'm pleased to say that we do seem to have Gen 4 speeds there. There's no downplaying there, there's no restrictions from what I can see. We've got the ×4, we've got the ×4, and again we've got the ×3, of course, 3×4 lane one there as well. We're not taking advantage of the PCIe, but at the very least we are definitely seeing some further stuff there in terms of the PCIe arrangement, and indeed that additional PCIe on the base of that MoBo was definitely the ×4 speed. And again, I really wish they could make more noise about that additional lane there on the base, because originally when we were looking at this MoBo for this video, it became abundantly clear very early doors that this was going to be an ideal motherboard for this build, and the fact that it's got another M2 NVMe slot on the base and it isn't really going through that enough is kind of surprising. But overall, I'd say right now, this is definitely an 8-bay NAS system that is ready to rock. We've not fully populated it yet, and if we go into the reporting section, we've not even had an opportunity enough in this video to really put this thing through its paces. But even now, with the CPU temperature living at a lovely little 20 to 40 degrees in a lot of places there, with, you know, with a good CPU should generally live in idle between 40, maybe 50, 60 at a top end. I think what we're seeing here is lovely numbers overall, and personally I'm quite pleased with what we're seeing here from this build here. Let's make our way back into the studio and summarise everything we've learned today. Okay, let's conclude. Let's start positive, shall we? Number one, this Erying MoBo, I'm super pleased about it. Again, as much as this is meant to be about the Jonsbo build, I've got to, you know, put some cred on this board. The fact that we're starting to see a lot more of these pre-attached motherboard bundles on the market now that used to be heavily dominated by Celerons and Pentiums, and now we're starting to see i5, i7 and i9s rocking out the gate, arguably, with scaled down processors inside for more mobile-based deployment. You know, it still means that for 300 NECA, we got a 12th gen i9 processor running inside this rig, and a NAS system that is really able to harness and make the most of it. And let's not discount the fact that thanks to that third M2 NVMe slot on side this, therefore making it a 3 NVMe and 2 SATA connected motherboard out the gate, meant that there is a lot we could do with the kind of hardware architecture afforded to us by the Jonsbo. Now, bringing the light back to that Jonsbo N3, there's still no avoiding that for an 8-bay, this is still quite a compact build. When we did our fractal node, I believe 804 versus Jonsbo N3 video, one of the things we touched on was that despite the other case being a decade old, this case here, although being relatively modern, released in the early stages of 2023 globally, it's still cramming everything in arguably in a way that it probably doesn't need to. And as good as case as this is, they really have squeezed everything together. And when we went for the cable funneling here and the proximity of a lot of the internal components, it did leave me wondering about whether things need to be that close together. It's still a fantastic case, and I would argue if you're looking for an 8-bay, this is by far one of the most compact 8-bays in the market. But just bear in mind that because of that compacted nature of its physical design, things are going to be close together. And for those more aggressive PCIe cards, we didn't even explore PCIe upgrades with this. Had we gone for a more modest card, we'd probably be absolutely fine. But given the height that this thing can support in terms of PCIe cards, and particularly if you were going to go GPU depth with a cooler on top, I think that amount of cramming inside there, and even when you're factoring additional cooling fans, is going to be a heavy concern. The rest of the components we use, right the way through from that cooler being available to us because of the extra size inside, absolute winner chicken dinner. And at about 22 nicker, it was an absolute steal. The memory, fine, memory's memory. Let's face it, it'd been ECC, we could talk about it. And again, another thing that stole the show for me was that more compact SFX PSU here from First Player, which, thanks to it being modular, thanks to it arriving relatively affordably to the other contenders in the market, and the fact that it was slightly smaller meant that we could take advantage of it to a greater degree inside this case in that more compact, busy environment internally. Now, the build in of itself, as an 8-bay, fantastic. As a system that can now, thanks to the evolution of the CPUs and the bundles on those M-ITX boards, opens the door to a system like this being able to use more aggressive CPUs, can only be a good thing. But just keep in mind that this is a system that's cramming a lot into a single box, and it's going to be a concern. And of course, as I mentioned, I frigging hate those trays. Now, needless to say, this is going to be here in the studio for quite a while, and therefore, in today's video, it was more about building it and seeing if it would work. After this, we want to know what else it can do. So, if you want to see more of this system and this build before we take it apart in a couple of months, let me know in the comments what you'd like to see. And the more popular suggestions from people is what we will go along with. You know, your power use, we would go for performance testing, but that's always going to be relative to the drives you put inside, and that's why we didn't include it in today's video. But this has been the Jonsbo N3 video. We got there in the end, didn't we? Thank you so much for watching in 2023, everyone. I really appreciate it. This is a small channel. It's just me and Eddie that run this gig. And frankly, for two of us, there's a heck of a lot to do for such a niche topic. And we wouldn't be able to get there if it wasn't for you guys. Thank you so much for supporting us, not just with, you know, donations or anything like that, but actually watching and steering the channel and helping us know what it is that we need to do for you guys to actually want to watch. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourselves a fantastic Christmas, and we will see you in 2024.